everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Faithful Giving in a Time of Change, a roundtable discussion of connectional giving in the United Methodist Church. We hope this discussion can help people better understand the role of giving in the church, as well as shed light on what has happened with apportioned giving in the denomination since the Special General Conference earlier this year. I'm Vicki Brown, news editor for United Methodist News. I'll be posing questions to our panelists. Here's the rundown of how this will unfold. There will be general questions for all the panelists and some questions for specific panelists who have expertise in that area. When a question is directed to a speaker, he or she will have 2 minutes to answer. In order to address as many questions as possible, a clock is available to help our panelists keep track of the time. Before we begin, I want to be upfront that United Methodist News receives its funding from church offering plates. However, as a journalistic organization, we strive to provide fair, balanced, and objective coverage of the denominational budget. This discussion is being recorded. It will be shared through social media and through church websites. Now let's get started with each panelist introducing themselves. Christine, would you begin?
Yes, thank you, Vicki. I'm Christine Dodson. I'm the conference treasurer for the North Carolina Annual Conference and also serve as vice chairperson for the General Council on Finance and Administration.
Hi, Vicki. I'm Reggie Clemens, and I'm an executive pastor at First United Methodist Church in Pearland, Texas, and I'm also a member of the General Council on Finance and Administration.
Vicki, my name's John Pierce. I'm a CPA, and I'm the chair of the Finance Committee at Belmont United Methodist Church in Nashville, and I'm also the president of the Council on Finance and Administration for the Tennessee Conference.
Okay. Hi, Vicki. I am Reverend Lisette Perez, an elder from the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference, serving at Oasis United Methodist Church in Pleasantville. I am also the president of Marcha, the National Hispanic Caucus, and ISDG, the Interethnic Strategy Development Group, and I also, as well, part of the connectional table.
Vicki, my name is Dennis Shaw, and I'm a recently retired elder in the Mountain Sky Conference, which was created out of the Rocky Mountain Conference and the Yellowstone Conference. I serve the conference on the Council of Finance Administration, as well as being the conference statistician.
All right, we're going to start with some general questions about giving. Reggie, what role does giving play in a connectional church?
Vicki, giving is an act of gratitude and of worship. It is truly what we do to respond to God for all that God has done for us. It is a biblical mandate, and we respond to that with gratitude and with joy. Giving should be an expression and an experience that makes us feel better about who we are in terms of helping the church and also helping one another.
Does anybody have anything to add to that?
I will say that as part of our Methodist tradition, John Wesley started to collect offering in all the class meetings in order to help the poor and reach out to others. I think it's part of our tradition, and we feel proud of giving for something bigger than us.
And I would add this, the connection piece. As a connection, we're able to give to a bigger organization that can do more than any of us can do individually at the local church level. By having the connection, we can do more.
Okay. So what questions are you hearing from local churches, John, about giving?
Well, the main question I hear from givers at the local church is how is their money being used and what is it being used for? I strongly believe that people give to churches if they are supportive and believe in the mission and what's being accomplished and feel like they're a part of that mission and it's making a difference in people's lives. So I think we as leaders in local churches have a responsibility to help carry that message and to help people understand exactly how their giving helps in very specific ways to make a difference in people's lives at the local level, at the country level, and globally. And how is it that if I give $1 to the church, that makes a difference in somebody's life somewhere? And how can I be a part of that? And I think that's what people want to hear about, and that's what we often get questions. Even if that's not their exact question, that's kind of what they're trying to get at, is what difference does it make that I've given some money? And I think we have a responsibility to help people understand that.
Okay.
Vicki, I think John is exactly right. There seems to be a feeling at the local church level particularly that we know we're putting money in the plate. but what happens to that money? How is that money distributed locally and then on an even broader scale than that? And I think that the churches, we do need to do a better job of explaining exactly what impacts every dollar that they give.
Okay.
And when we talk about mission, we talk about praying, we talk about giving, and we talk about going. And when people have the opportunity to see how many things we can do as a church, and our mission is more than just praying, giving, and also going. As a person that have served the church at the different levels in the local church and the general agencies in General Board of Ministries and at the conference level, I can see how the church's use of the monies in different places, and it's so important for us to connect with what we're doing as well.
And some of it we do in a way that we understand what's happened, but other people may not. For example, the Ebola crisis in Liberia. Night after night after night, they would have someone talking about what was going on in Liberia. And most of the nights, they would be standing in front of a hospital that had a cross and flame on it. The announcer never said a word about that being sponsored by the United Methodist Church. But those of us in the Methodist Church could see that cross and flame, and we could see that connection between our offering plate and that cross and flame in Ebola, in Ebola-laden Liberia, and we could know that we were making a difference there.
And it's such a powerful witness to the love of Christ and the way that we can be part of that connection and part of that family together. I'm from a very small membership rural church in North Carolina, and just the power of knowing that we sit where we do on Sunday mornings and we're in worship and all through the week, and through our giving we are literally in ministry around the world through the connection of the United Methodist Church is very powerful.
Amen.
Okay. So Christine, what are we seeing happening with giving trends in the church? Are we seeing trends vary by region in the U.S., and if so, why?
I think that a lot of the way that we approach giving trends, it does depend sometimes on the different levels that you're talking about within the church. At the general church, we've obviously heard reports that have come from the General Council on Finance Administration that giving is down to the general church overall this year in 2019 compared to previous years, and some of that also depends on which fund you're talking about. So we are seeing some reduction in that, kind of maybe across the board for the general church level. At the annual conference level, I can say that for North Carolina, we're actually at this point in the year just a bit ahead of where we were in previous years. So we don't necessarily see that reduction there in North Carolina, and some of my colleagues in other annual conferences are reporting a similar thing, that they're staying about where they were compared to last year in those giving levels. We've talked a bit about giving in a local church as well, and following some of the trends that we've seen over the last few years about giving in a local church. We do see some reduction in maybe giving percentage rates with some of those, as we've had changes in worship service attendance and all of those things at the local church. But what we're seeing kind of across the board, dollar-wise, they're staying pretty consistent. So when we look at the base of those who are giving, and they're giving around the same dollars, but the base has gone down, then that means giving for that base then is kind of up. We're looking at how we face prioritization of giving in the local church when there's so many other competing areas that are coming towards. So we're seeing some change the general church level, but my experience in the annual conference, at least where I am, it's been pretty consistent.
And Christine, I would say my experience is consistent with that, and I think you're spot on. And some of the studies that are out there nationally suggest that fewer people are giving to churches, but the giving level seems to be relatively stable, which means fewer people are giving more money. And my concern with that is the aging of the giving, that we're having more and more older people. We're all getting older every year, but the giving age is going higher, and we're not doing a good enough job reaching younger people in terms of starting them giving and making that happen. So I think we have a long-term issue there, that older group that's continuing to give more and more cannot do that forever for obvious reasons, and so we've got to find ways to get younger folks more into the making those gifts to make up the difference.
My concern with that is what's going to happen to the future generation. We invest so much money in our children and grandchildren for their college education, for their possibilities of them better themselves in their lives, and how much we are investing for them to keep their faith, and how much are we putting in our churches in order to preserve the church and continue our tradition and continue the importance of being a Christian and being good disciples for this future generation in times where there is so much need because people are struggling in life, and there are so many ways of us continuing the faith as we continue to give more for the goodness of the future generation.
Dennis, how have General Conference and its aftermath affected giving this year?
Well, I can speak specifically to the Mountain Sky Conference. I can talk to that, and I can say that our overall giving to the conference level is down about 10%. Since General Conference. Is that all attributable to General Conference 2019? Who knows? But I can tell you that at the conference level we have seen a decline of income. And some of it is you go back and talk to local pastors, local churches and their lay leadership as well as their pastors. There's a wide range of answers as to what's going on. You have some churches that are extremely unhappy. Well, you have a lot of churches that are unhappy with the way General Conference ended up, and the manner and the process of how that ended up. And so some very important people have walked away from the Methodist Church at the local church level, which clearly has an impact at that church. And it's no clear answer as to whether it's traditionalist or progressives. It's both. It's a both and. Okay. People that are dissatisfied with that, and we've got to figure out a way, of course, to stop the fighting and get back to the mission of the church and focus on that.
Does anybody have anything?
I think that's a good response, Dennis. One thing that's absolutely clear, though, Vicki, is that there's a great deal of uncertainty in our church today, and whether or not there are statistics or data to support what people may be doing to respond or not respond to that is not necessarily clear at this point, but we do know that people aren't really clear about where we're going. And I think as we go into the next General Conference, that's going to be the priority so that in essence people will be able to make some decisions. There's several other factors I think that may be affecting overall giving from annual conferences. I can surely tell you that in Texas, we're still responding to the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. Right. And also now the new tropical storm Imelda. So in essence, there may be additional reasons that impact the giving on the local church level to the conference. So it's all not about the General Conference, but there certainly is a great deal of uncertainty.
Okay. And I would add, in addition to that, talking about the aftermath from General Conference, that we've certainly seen some churches that were pleased with General Conference, with the way things went. We have some of those that are continuing to respond to the connectional church in the way that they have done in the past. We have some churches that were not happy with the way General Conference worked and maybe withholding apportionments and not paying those their connectional giving this year because they were not happy with the way General Conference went. We had some churches that were happy with the way General Conference went, but not happy that it didn't go further, who are also withholding apportionments and kind of holding back a little bit. So we've got, if we were able to consider these in a spectrum, the way that we tend to do with a traditional side, a progressive side, and we tend to objectify those two sides, then if we were looking at that, then we have people at both ends of that spectrum that are doing a similar response. They're doing a similar thing based on the same exact event. So we have seen some of that, but I will offer, at least in North Carolina, that's not been the majority. So we spend a lot of time talking about responses to General Conference. So far, that's not played out to be our majority response in North Carolina. So we still have people who are within the connection, who are within the ministry of the United Methodist Church and pleased to do so and still committed to that ministry, that are still together in what we're doing in the connectional church.
And I would just add, in the Tennessee Conference, we're 10 to 15% down versus last year, and I don't know all the reasons for that. We like to blame it on General Conference. I don't really know if that's the truth. I know there's people unhappy on both sides, the uncertainty, Reggie, as you talked about. But I think one of the things we have responsibility as leaders is to say that the answer to that frustration, the answer to that uncertainty is not to withhold your apportionments. Because if that's the answer and we become crippled financially, we're not going to be able to get through these issues. And we have to help people understand that the vast majority of the money they give for apportionments is not going to these issues that they're unhappy about. It's going to help people in need and that have very real day-to-day needs throughout the whole world. And so stopping paying apportionments is not the solution to the frustrations and the disagreements that we're having. It weakens us and it weakens our ability to be in ministry and serve people in need. And I think the more we can educate people about what apportionments are actually used for, it would help. I know people are frustrated and they want to have a way to vent their frustration, and so they choose, well, I'm just not going to pay apportionments. Well, I think we have to help people understand that's not the answer.
I think it's important to keep that passion of trying to make sure that we understand what is our mission. Our mission to reach out to others and make disciples of Jesus Christ to transform the world. And in the midst of all the things that we are experiencing and lack of resources, sometimes we don't realize the impact that it has on people and churches and around the world that are making church out of nothing. So it's extremely important that we keep that passion, because we're a global church and we are making impact to a lot of people that are in need.
Okay.
I'd like to add one point, that when you talk to people at the local church level, they don't often use the word mistrust or trust in the conversation. But then as you talk to them and you hear them talk, you begin to hear the fact that there is this distrust. And it's frankly endemic of the culture at large that we live in. Right. It's not just about the church. Yes. But you find a situation where people trust people locally, but they don't trust people outside the local area. And what I hear people talking about over and over and over again is they talk about those people, and they communicate an idea of lack of trust about what is going to happen at places beyond their own church. And you hear that over and over and over again. Mistrust, distrust seems to be an important part of this, leading to this uncertainty that Reggie was driving at. And their certainty is that they can mistrust the people that are there doing this.
I think you're right that that's not just the church.
Yeah.
Do you have any any of you have any thoughts on how the church combats that?
Well, my view is that the church, one of the critiques of the church by the unchurched is we're hypocrites, that we don't live out, we're acting as if we're Christians. And I would say part of the way we play that out, to answer that, is to be the living embodiment of Christ in the world. If Christ is the human face of God with flesh and bones, then we need to be the embodiment of Christ in the world and try to do that. And we need to set aside our own peculiarities, our own idiosyncrasies and things like that, and try to be Christ in the world. It's challenging, and Wesley would call that moving on to perfection. That's the goal for us, but how do we do that? How we model it and model it and model it, and when in doubt, model it some more.
Okay.
Well, it's also how we respond, generosity and love. So it's the way that we choose to receive. So we give trust. We want to receive trust. We want to be in an environment of trust. So that means we give trust. You don't demand trust. You give trust. And so we take personal responsibility for that. And it's how we give that generosity of love and how we deal with each other. The important part of the way we interact in the church and also with culture at large is in the way that we receive the offerings of others. So, and if we respond with an attitude of generosity to receiving the offerings of others. So if Reggie comes to me and asks me for information or brings a topic to me to discuss, then do I receive that with good intentions from Reggie, or do I question? Why did Reggie ask me that question? Where is he going with that? Or do I give out of my generosity of love for Reggie, that I know that he comes with good intentions and that Reggie is a person of God and that he is coming to serve God even in the way that we approach. So the way that we counteract that in the church is that we model that we model that generosity and we give that trust and model that trust for others so that we then are the example to others in culture that we might bring them along as well.
Okay.
Following that, I mean, we have to keep preaching and teaching about how important it is to give. And in that process, we have to give with joy, because we have the promise that if we give with joy, we'll be blessed. Once you put the offering in the plate and you raise that plate in after singing the doxology at church, you just ask God, help us to expand your kingdom, help us. And when it's consecrated, we just hoping and pray that we're good stewards so we can continue to preach to others about the good news. It's all about that. It's putting it as a spiritual discipline as well.
So I think you have sort of answered this question, but does anybody have anything to add about giving trends playing out at the local church, and what are people struggling with when it comes to giving? Anybody got anything to add on that?
There are probably several different responses to that question. So I'll try to give you a couple. Again, a lack of understanding in terms of exactly what it is that what's happening with these dollars. I think that in regard to stewardship education, that what the church is trying to get away from and probably needs to get away from is that just give your money to the church. I think there's all kind of studies out there right now that'll show you that people are still giving. They're just not always giving it to the church.
Right.
They're still giving. The church is not this one place where you should just give here. There's all kinds of wonderful things that people can contribute to. We've got to take the opportunity to let people know why it is a value and important to give to our ministries and to our mission and to those things that we do. We've got to make that a priority in their lives. And I think you will see people respond in a greater way, just like they're responding to other things that they contribute to.
And I think that's right. Well said, Reggie. I think also helping people understand how they can be a part of that ministry and how they're giving, and in giving them not just their money but their time. And people will give their money to things that they believe in and they participate in and they think are making a difference in the world. Right. And I think so. I agree completely with you. And I would just add to help not just their money but help get them involved in actually hands-on ministry. And people's money will follow what they're passionate about. And if you get them involved in ministry and helping people, the money will follow.
Yeah, it's time, talent, and treasure. And sometimes you get them involved in time and talent first, the treasure will follow.
Okay.
And also, if I heard that if we all give 10% in our local church, we don't have to do fundraising at all. And Dennis did a study that it would be awesome if you can share. And it was simple mathematics, but it helped us to understand that we can give more of what we are giving. You want to share that?
Well, what I did was I took a look at my local church in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I just took a look at where they were from zip codes. And then I looked at the median income for the families there. And then I summed that up, right? Proportionalized it, then summed it up. And I got that we were at about the 1.5% level of income. And so it gave me some measure of the distance I've got from where we might be to from where we are. I didn't try to. They call guilt the gift that give guilt to the gift that keeps on giving. I tried not to offer guilt, but I did try to show people where they were in relation to the society that we lived in there in Salt Lake. And
the importance is to give in proportion of what we give, because that shows our priorities. Yeah. Right. And it's part of what we believe, you know. And it's extremely important. That's why I always remember Jesus when he was watching at the Pharisee versus that widow. She gave everything. Right. And it's the proportion, because that's how much you love God. That's how much you want to invest and give to the church, so we can continue and be in mission.
All right. So, Lizette, what impact has the decline in giving had on racial ethnic ministries and congregations?
What impact? In reality, I was talking to some of my colleagues that we don't realize that the churches, a local church will not be interested in working with racial, ethnic, or people who are different to the the church, unless there is the leader, unless there is resources, unless there are people who are interested in intentionally reaching out to people who are different to them. So when we don't receive enough resources, the groups that is more affected in the local church and in the denomination are the racial ethnics. We represent 10% of the denomination in the United States. That says that we need to work more of trying to reach out to people who are different to us. There was a time in our denomination that we created that as a priority, the racial ethnic local church priority. And there were some monies that were invested on that, but we still have a lot to do. The good news is that racial ethnic ministries are growing. Believe it or not, the non-racial ethnic are going down while the racial ethnics are growing in our denomination. We still need to do more. It is extremely important to pay attention to racial ethnic ministries as we try to grow the church. And if there is less resources, usually they look at the racial ethnic groups because that's a way to reduce. We spend intentionally in our denomination around $12 million for the national plans for racial ethnic ministries. That is money that have helped us to grow in our denomination. And sometimes people say, why do we have to have these national plans for the racial ethnics? Well, there's a lot of things that we have been able to do because we are going in different places that there was no racial ethnic ministries at all. And there are racial ethnic people in our nation that we have to preach the good news. They are there. So we just have to make sure that we are not a church that is only for one group of people, but for all people. Because at the end, we are called to preach the good news to the whole world and all the nations. So I'm hoping that people understand the importance and the role of the denomination and the funds for racial ethnic, the importance of the national plans, and the importance of the national agencies because they pay attention to the racial ethnic programs as well.
Okay. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
I think she's answered the question about as well as can be answered. I very simply, there needs to be an understanding that if there are fewer dollars coming in, everybody's going to get less money. Some of those agencies and entities that are smaller truly count on those dollars a lot more than some of the larger ones. So they're obviously going to have a greater negative impact if they're not getting as much funding to do what needs to be done.
I would like to add that if it's not because of the funds of the general church, I would not be able to be in my local church. My local church now is a Hispanic Latino church reaching out to others as well. And it is because of funds from the national plan of the National Plan for Hispanic Latino Ministry from GBGM, funds from the conference and the district that are allowing me as an elder to be a pastor of that church. And if it was not because of these funds, we would not be able to reach out to the Hispanic Latino community. My mother was the founder of that church, and we are celebrating 30 years of Hispanic Latino ministry in that area at this moment. And it's because of funds that comes from other churches. That's what the apportionments and share giving is all about. Churches that have the resources put it in a collective fund, and then it's distributed to the churches that needs the support in order to move forward. That's a giving. That's the most important piece of giving.
I'd like to offer a comment, though, on related to the topic, but from a little different perspective, which is our assumptions. And we need to be aware of the fact that there are many ethnic churches that are make extremely powerful statements about who they are with their own sharing. Two of our most powerful churches in the Mountain Sky Conference are a Korean American church in Colorado Springs and a historically black church in Denver. They are well off economically, and they share their resources with the rest of the conference joyfully, willingly. And so consequently, the perception that that funds flow only to ethnic and minority churches is not totally valid. They also, funds come back from them and they share that with the rest of the connection.
Okay, thank you. So we're now going to turn to the budget and giving process. And each of you has been involved in setting a proposed budget at the local, annual, or general church level. And what considerations go into that, and how do fluctuations in giving ultimately affect what the church is able to do? Reggie, would you like to?
Thank you, Vicki. I certainly would. Since we just went through this process at my church last night in regard to getting the budget approved at the finance committee level, certainly as we set the budgets every year, we go through an analysis of what we've actually done the previous year, particularly what our giving has been the previous year, then what our needs of ministry and mission are, and certainly operationally. But I think everything's really key for what do we want to do ministry, and then how are we going to be able to support that from the standpoint of our gifts and giving. And then from that perspective, as we set the budget, we typically look, this is the portion that we're going to have for our mission, of which we do include the apportionment of connectional giving as part of our missional budget. Okay. That's because we feel that's what it is. And then we set the other areas of our budget up, and then we're at that point getting it approved by our ministry council, and we move forward. So that's kind of locally how we approach it.
And I agree with that. I think one of the challenges we see, or I've seen at the local church level, is a budget is just a plan. It's a plan for the year, and you have to fund that every Sunday and every week. You have to keep funding it. And in our church, I think probably with a lot of churches, we receive a disproportionately large amount of our income in December. So we're on a calendar year. So the problem we have is a cash flow issue throughout the year, and you can't not pay salaries, you can't not pay the electric bill, and unfortunately one of the things that you seem to be able to defer is apportionments, your payment to the conference. And I think that happens a lot. And so we end up, and I see other churches doing this, paying a large percentage of their share of conference apportionments in the end of the year, in the November-December time frame. But I see that happening a lot. But I think you have to, if I can use the term, sell your budget every single month. And you have to help people understand how giving to that budget helps with ministry and makes ministry occur. Otherwise, you're going to end up at the end of the year in a really bad spot, and you can't recover from it.
I believe that when you see a budget of a church or at any level in the denomination, you're supposed to see what is your mission. You know, when you see the numbers, then that's telling you where is the priority of the mission. So budget is stewardship, but then in reality it's connected to our mission. What are we supposed to do? What are we called to do as a church? And that is not only at the local church level, but for example, when we were working with the allocation at the connectional table, with all the funds around the denomination and how to allocate them and do a good job in being good stewards. The first thing that we say, okay, let's set up some core values to understand how we're going to do this. And the core values include the mission. What is the mission of the United Methodist Church? What is the mission of the agencies? And what are our priority in our mission? All the priorities, all the emerging priorities as well. All of that is connected to what is our mission. And then stewardship. Stewardship from the perspective of, okay, we need to make sure that it's transparent. Equity and justice, to make sure that those resources or those agencies, for example, that have less opportunities or less resources, well, let's don't touch them because they will not exist if they don't have all the support. And equity in terms of, okay, which agencies and which programs will be in jeopardized if they don't receive the funds. And then at the end, our work was basically to make sure that we kept those two in mind, the mission and being good stewards and equity in the process. The same thing happened at all levels. If we keep that together, it's extremely important for us to survive like that as a church.
And at the general church level, I'll offer that input from the connectional table was one important part of what went into setting that budget that is being proposed for the next quadrennium. And it was one part. So we had several different teams working through that process where we had a connectional table bringing in ministry needs and funding requests. We also had the Economic Advisory Committee that looks at the prevailing economic conditions all over. They are intended to be our more objective group that looks at what's going on in other places in the economy and in attendance or some of the factors, some of the bigger factors that happen. So they give input. And the input that they give is basically kind of almost a top dollar that the general agencies and GCFA then should consider in what's recommended to the General Conference to be voted on. So the Economic Advisory Committee gives input, Connectional Table gives input, there's a budget advisory team that's made up of individuals from the Connectional Table as well as GCFA that also give input. They set core principles, values, just like the Connectional Table did, and the things they're going to look at as they're looking for that budget. And then finally a budget goes then to GCFA that also works at a joint meeting with the Connectional Table for some final budget that then is recommended to go to General Conference for consideration. For this quadrennium, the overall budget that's being proposed is a $105 million reduction that came from input from all across the board on what local churches may be able to fund, the way we're in ministry together, and trying to put that priority together. So we did see that reduction that's coming in what's being proposed to General Conference. And then we all know that when it goes to General Conference, there will be some motions that may come that could add to that, could reduce that. There are changes that could happen at General Conference. And then that's what ultimately is used to create the apportionments that are then allocated to the annual conferences and from there down to the local church. So that starts from the general agency budget, from that general conference apportionment, starts with all of these groups and all the feedback that they receive, and then goes to general conference for vote. And then the delegations who are there, they're the ones that vote on that. So they're the ones that set that budget for the next quadrennium, and then the apportionments and that allocation comes through GCFA that goes out to the annual conferences.
So John, could you speak to how money goes from the offering plate to the connection?
Well, sure. I think Christina's done a good job of that already with her last response. But I would say that I think it's important for us to realize that money that is spent in the church, whether it's globally or the global church or at the conference level, all that money comes from a contribution by some individual at the local church level. We call it the offering plate, which is kind of a 1950s way of thinking about it. But some people do put money into the offering plate. But there's lots of ways to give, whether it's electronic or lots of other ways than just putting in the offering plate. But I think it's important that you have as broad a group as possible having input into how that money is used. And so the local church gets together and has broad input into how their budget goes, which includes what goes to the conference. And the conference has the same through their CFA and the annual conference meetings. And I think Christine kind of alluded to all that. So the part I guess I would add is let's never lose sight of the fact that all that money comes from somebody making a decision to make a donation at a local church level. That's where all of it comes from.
All right, so now we're going to talk for a minute about the apportionment system. And Dennis, could you speak to whether the system is designed to allow people or conferences to designate givings for specific funds? And I would say that one of the things we get asked that a lot is.
Well, I'm going to treat the specific funds as the 7 general funds that support the general church, and plus we also have the jurisdictional funds that we worry about as well. But the conference has near total control over that, at least at their level. At least most conferences have near total control over that at their own level. Many conferences budget that money into their budgets, and then they make a decision as to how much of that is going to be supported and paid by them. Legacy Rocky Mountain, Legacy Yellowstone paid 100% of their general and jurisdictional apportionments for many years as part of our DNA as to who we are. But that having been said, some conferences now, Mountain Sky is one of those, is that we're now moving to a place where we're transferring that authority to the local church. We are giving a number to the local church as to what their share is of the general and jurisdictional apportionment, and we're even telling them what the subcomponents are for those 8 funds, and we're going to allow them to make that decision. So the question is that at the conference level, do they have control? Yes, they do, absolutely. The further you move from the conference level, the more people have to operate with greater intentionality as to how they do that. For example, if the trust is not high at a local church and they're concerned that the World Service Fund is not being supported at the level they want it to be, they always have the option of sending resources directly to the World Service Fund here in Nashville. They could do that if they want to. Individuals could have the same authority if they wanted to do that as well.
And I'd just like to add in, and Dennis and I talked about this earlier, I think designated giving is a slippery slope. And we need to balance the rights of donors, and donors should have the right to give to what they want to give to. We need to keep that in mind. But the flip side of that is, and Christine talked about this, there's this process where you have lots of people involved in deciding how you're going to spend the money. And when you allow people to start designating, either at the individual level or at the church level, what they're going to give to, it takes the place of that collective wisdom and collective input of what we need to do as a church and what we've decided through the input of many people, by allowing the donors to decide what you're going to spend your money on and what your budget is, as opposed to the process. And I think that's something that we have to, it's a healthy tension that we need to keep out there. If everybody wanted to designate what they give their money to in every church, then you don't need budgets anymore. And so, and you don't have the ability to do things long term, and who's going to designate their money to pay to the electric company? I mean, there's some things that are not as exciting as others to designate to. And so I think we have to be very careful with designated giving.
I was the chairman of the board for a nonprofit in Colorado Springs which helped people in need, primarily helped them with utility bills and helped them with clothing and rent assistance. And everybody wanted to designate their offering so that it went directly to a person in need. But we still have to pay the executive director. We still had to pay for the people doing the development of the resources. And we got to a place in about 2002, 2003, where we had plenty of resources to give away, but we didn't have anybody to administer it. And that's exactly what John is talking about. You've got to be very careful. It works okay if 5% of the people do it. It starts to really break down when 95% of the people want to do it. It doesn't work then.
Christine, could you talk about how we describe apportionments? Some people have referred to it as a tax. Others say you should look at it as a subscription service like Netflix. Is either of those terms appropriate?
At the annual conference, we've certainly heard those terms. So we've heard, the tax, we've heard the subscription service, we've heard the dues, we've heard franchise fees, we've heard all kinds of names attached to that. And in my opinion, as I've gone through and been with local churches when we've talked about that and tried to help them understand the apportionment process and connectional giving in general, what I've found out is that when churches begin to understand the way that money is used, those names fall away, because they begin to understand that this is the way that we are in connectional ministry. So those are ministry dollars. They're not a Netflix subscription that you pay and then you receive something back. You don't give with that intention of receiving back. You give because God first gave to you. And that's why you give to support the ministry of Jesus Christ, and you give to support the connection and the way that we do ministry globally, that we're all over the place doing ministry. So we give with that intention that we give to ministry versus I give so that I receive something. So I don't find those descriptors to be accurate, though I understand why, if you didn't understand the way we do budgeting or the apportionment system or the connection or the family, because we as a connection, we're the family of the United Methodist Church. And when we don't understand our ministry family, then understand why it may appear that way. But I don't find that to be accurate. And I have observed as I've met with churches and they've come to understand the way that we fund the ministry of our family, of our Methodist family, that those terms do tend to fall away.
And I'd like to add, I agree 100% with what you just said. It's all about educating people and understanding what it's used for. But my frustration is with the term apportion. I think using that term puts you in a negative light before you get started, before you get to the education. We've used an accounting, only in the Methodist Church, we've used an accounting term that's a verb to apportion, and we've turned it into a noun and we call it apportionments. And so the wording and the language we use to people that don't understand all the things that you're talking about immediately sends you into these negative places that don't speak to the fact that it's about mission and ministry, and those dollars are used to help people make a difference in their lives throughout the world. And I'm on a personal mission to get us to quit using that term. I don't have any expectation that I'll ever win that. But if we wouldn't use the term to apportion, and we would use terms that describe what it is, like ministry shares or connectional commitments or whatever terms we could use that are more descriptive of what it actually is, the things that Christine was talking about, we wouldn't have to start the educational process by getting over the term. And that's the part that I think we put ourselves in a bad spot to begin with.
Well, as a journalist, we always like more accessible terms too. So we,
Well, you
Or
also
descriptive
like,
terms.
you also like terms that are accepted across the, in our
Right.
case, across the connection. And so the word apportionment is understood across the connection, even though I agree with John about the comment about verbs and nouns. It is an accounting term.
right.
And you hear all kinds of terms of expressing how it might be an alternative. Mountain Sky, we've experimented with connectional giving. We've experimented with mission shares. I would say that it would be good for us if once we decide how we're going to call it, let's call it that for a long time.
Agreed.
In my conference, we use shared giving.
Okay.
Shared giving, and it's the same. The concept helps to understand what is the purpose. I agree with you.
Okay. How does the apportioned dollar break down in terms of the money that stays in the annual conference and the money that goes to general church ministries?
Well, I'll offer in North Carolina, out of every dollar that's given in the local church, 88% of that stays within the local church, and that's based on our statistical table reporting. 88% stays in the local church. Then of the remaining 12%, 3% of that comes to the general agency, and the rest remains with the annual conference, for the annual conference ministries.
Are there repercussions for not paying apportionments?
Of course, it stops the opportunities of reaching out to others and seeing being part of the big mission of the church. That means that we will not reach out as much when we have less resources. And I think that it's important for as a pastor, our role as a pastor, to motivate people to be part of the giving. And I would like for you to, Christine, to mention the survey that you did in your annual conference. It would be good to share that with us.
Sure. Well, it wasn't a study we did in North Carolina, but it was a study done by a conference treasurer that has retired now. So this person has retired, and it was several years ago. But in their annual conference, what they found out was, as they looked at giving trends in local churches, and then also following those giving trends for pastors, what they found out was in that annual conference were the pastors that were at churches that paid 100% consistently. When that pastor moved to another church, was reappointed, if that pastor was appointed to a church that generally paid less than 100%, in about 2 or 3 years, that church was back up to 100%. And also, likewise, if the pastor generally was at a church that paid less than 100%, and that pastor was reappointed to a church that paid 100%, within 2 or 3 years, that church would drop below 100%. So the numbers, it wasn't a scientific study, but it was detailed information in that annual conference. Then what that found then was that giving trend tends to follow the pastor. So it tends to follow the leadership as that leadership moves from one church to another. That's not in every case, but as a trend, it does tend to follow that pastor. So it reinforces the importance then, what Lisette was saying, it reinforces the importance of that pastoral leadership in giving that very clear direction of why we do what we do in the connectional church, why we are connectional, how are we a family, how do we do ministry together and live into that. That follows in general from that study the pastor. And I'll offer that my observation from our annual conference as well is that it does tend to follow that. So it's important for our clergy and our lay leadership as well in local churches to pay attention to what they're saying, how they're promoting connectional giving, how are they talking about that when they're telling the story of the connectional giving in the local church, because the church is listening. There are ways that church will follow the direction there of that pastor in that setting. So it's important that our pastoral leadership then pay attention and learn more so that they can help to educate people about the way we do ministry in the United Methodist Church.
Okay. Does anybody have anything they want to add to the discussion?
I want to come back to the way Reggie started it, and I cannot emphasize to you strongly enough that we need to create at the leadership level, lay and clergy, an attitude of gratitude. I would state that we need to be thinking about giving at the congregational level, at the local church level. My own observation would be, let's worry less about the conference and the general church, and you get this term, a rising tide lifts all boats. And if we could focus on improving the financial stability at the local church level, I tend to think that the conference and the general church will follow along. And I think part of it is this nature of we're responding in gratitude. I think it's also the issue, coming back to what Christine said, it's a function also of your own leadership, both lay and clergy leadership. I started off 20 years ago in ministry giving almost none of my income to the local church. Okay, and a person told me just try to build it up a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. In 2018, my wife and I gave 20% of our income to the local church, 20%. And it worked. We still continue to put food on the table, and it all worked. But we did it joyfully. We enjoyed doing it a great deal. So if you told me 20 years ago I'd be sitting on a panel talking nationally about how to be a good steward, I would have said, on what planet? On what planet? But I think my comment to the lay and clergy leadership is that tell your own story. And tell your own story about what a change it has made in your own life, and this profound attitude of gratitude, and how it is that you have been enriched by what it is you've done.
I think that what is important is that we give with joy. Yeah. We give with gratitude, with this knowing that we are blessed when we give, and we give with generosity, and that keeps the church alive. A church that gives is a church that is passionate about Jesus, passionate about responding to the gospel. So when we give with joy, blessings come after that. That's the promise that God has given to us.
Okay.
Vicki, I'd like to also add this, that we've got to say thanks to the people of the United Methodist Church. People at my church have heard me say this. We can stand up in the pulpit and preach about stewardship until Jesus comes back. And we can truly preach that. And if all the light bulbs go off and people get it, that doesn't mean that they're going to give to our local church. That means they're going to give somewhere because they've understood it. As we go through the process of truly letting people know the wonderful things that we're able to do, we just got to take the time to say, thank you for supporting those things, and thank you for all that you do to make the United Methodist Church what it is.
Amen. Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone for making the time to participate in this panel discussion. I hope and pray that this discussion will help United Methodist understand the role of giving in the mission of our church. For our viewers, we urge you to share the video with your friends and through your networks. Links to resources about giving can be found at the end of this video. Thank you all again.
Thank you very much.